Ever catch yourself marveling at how we can just talk and actually share our thoughts and feelings using this thing we call language?
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? I mean, we effortlessly string together these sounds, words, to express such complex meaning.
Right. It's wild. Just the other day, I was trying to order a coffee.
Oh, those coffee orders can get intense.
Seriously, I wanted, one of those drinks with a million modifications, and it hit me. This is kind of amazing.
What we take for granted.
Totally.
Yeah.
We're essentially taking these abstract thoughts and encoding them into these sounds so that someone else can decode them and understand exactly what we mean, even if it's just a complicated coffee order.
Exactly. The human brain's capacity for language is incredible.
It really is. So today we're diving into that fascinating world of language, how our brains make this magic happen. And we're doing it with help from a neuroscience textbook chapter on, appropriately enough, language.
Always going to have those sources. And as always, we'll be pulling out those key aha moments, those insights that make you appreciate this 3-pound universe we call the brain.
Okay, so let's start simple. What is language? I mean, the text defines it as a system of sounds, symbols, and gestures for communication, but it's got to be more than that, right?
It's the heart of human connection. It's how we share ideas, build relationships, tell stories.
And while humans have come up with writing and all that, spoken language just seems to be our thing, something we're naturally wired for.
Totally. The text even mentions over 10% of the world's population can't read, highlighting how complex reading is compared to how naturally we learn to speak.
Which leads to the big question. How do babies, with their still developing brains, figure this whole language thing out so fast? It's not like they come preloaded with dictionaries.
One of the biggest mysteries in neuroscience, for sure. Imagine a baby hears this constant stream of sound, no clear breaks between words.
Like reading a sentence with no spaces.
Exactly. It should be impossible.
So how do they crack the code?
The text points to something called statistical learning. Basically, babies are like these tiny statisticians analyzing the probabilities of certain sound combinations.
Statistical learning sounds a bit technical.
Essentially, they figure out pre is more likely followed by a noti in pretty than, say, ba from baby. They're picking up on those patterns.
So they deduce word boundaries based on how often sounds appear together. That's incredible. Little linguists running statistical analysis without even realizing it. Makes you wonder, could we teach AI that way?
Now, there's a thought. Researchers are definitely exploring that. And speaking of babies and language, we can't forget motherese.
Ah, yes, that sing-song way we talk to babies. Is there proof it actually helps?
It's still being studied, but the text suggests it might help babies differentiate between sounds. Imagine trying to learn a language where everything sounds mushed together.
A jumbled mess of sounds.
Right. Motherese, with its exaggerated tones and slower pace, might help babies pick out individual sounds from the chaos.
It's like we're giving them a cheat sheet, highlighting the important parts.
Exactly. Now, we've talked about learning language, but where does all this processing happen in the brain?
Taking it to the brain. Always a good move.
To understand that, we got to go back in time, look at some groundbreaking case studies that changed how we view the brain and language. And it starts with Paul Broca and his famous patient.
Broca's area, I've definitely heard of that. Something to do with actually speaking, right?
You got it. Broca's big breakthrough came in 1861. He was studying this patient who could only say one syllable, tan. Sadly, the man passed away soon after, and during the autopsy, Broca found something amazing.
What did he find?
A lesion, a damaged area, in the patient's left frontal lobe. This led him to propose that this specific area, now called Broca's area, is crucial for speech.
So it's like the command center in the brain for putting our thoughts into words.
Good way to put it. But of course, brains are never that simple. Turns out there's another VIP in this language system, Wernicke's area.
Okay, so what's Wernicke's area up to? Is that involved in speaking too?
It is, but differently. About a decade after Broca, Carl Wernicke found that damaging a different part of the left hemisphere, an area in the temporal lobe, messed with language too. But unlike with Broca's patients, those with damage to this area could speak fluently.
Oh. So what was the problem?
Their words were all jumbled. Imagine a word salad grammatically correct, but totally meaningless.
So their brains were telling their mouths to speak, but the message itself was garbled, like their internal dictionaries got scrambled.
Exactly. And this difference, fluent but meaningless speech versus struggling to speak at all, was a major clue that different brain areas handle different aspects of language. This led to identifying different types of aphasia, which is the loss of language abilities after brain damage.
Okay, so we have Broca's aphasia, where you know what you want to say but can't, and Wernicke's aphasia, where the words flow but make no sense. The text had those vivid examples like Mr. Ford, who could only get out a few words.
Right, Mr. Ford struggling with Broca's aphasia. And then there was Mr. Gorgon, who spoke almost nonstop, but it was this jumble of words and phrases, classic Wernicke's aphasia.
It's fascinating and kind of scary how damage to such specific spots can totally mess with communication. Shows how intricate our brains are.
Absolutely. And to explain how these areas work together, Wernicke, along with another neuroscientist, Norman Geschman, proposed this model of language processing in the brain.
Okay, so we've got Broca's area for producing speech, Wernicke's area for understanding meaning, and damage to either one leads to some pretty specific language issues. But how do these areas actually work together? It's like you need a direct line between them for language to flow smoothly.
That's exactly what Wernicke and Geschman thought. Their model proposed that when you hear a word, the sound is first processed in the auditory cortex, kind of like the brain's reception area for sounds.
Yeah.
Then that signal travels to Wernicke's area where the meaning is decoded, basically where your brain figures out what the word means.
So if I hear the word coffee, my auditory cortex is all, hey, a sound.
Sure.
And then Wernicke's area chimes in with, ah, delicious caffeinated goodness.
You got it. And then if you wanted to repeat the word coffee, the signal would go from Wernicke's area over to Broca's area.
Which is in charge of, what was it again?
Planning the movements for speech. Think of Broca's area as the choreographer, sending instructions to your tongue, lips, and vocal cords.
Like, okay, team, here's how we're going to make the sounds coffee.
Precisely.
I like it. So it's like a relay race of information through the brain. But the text mentioned something about this model not being totally complete.
Ah, yes. Well, like most things in the brain, it's a bit more complicated than that. For one, the model suggests this very linear pathway, but we know information can travel between these areas through multiple routes.
Backup routes for language, like a linguistic GPS.
Love that analogy. And this redundancy is super important because it means if one pathway is damaged, the brain can sometimes compensate.
The brain is amazing like that, always adapting.
Exactly.
Makes you appreciate what's happening every time we talk or understand each other.
Behind the scenes of every conversation.
Right. Speaking of connections, the text also talked about conduction aphasia, which seems to highlight how important those pathways really are.
Ah, yes, conduction aphasia. It's a fascinating example of how the model, even with its limitations, can make predictions. You see, Wernicke himself hypothesized that if there was this specific bundle of nerve fibers connecting Broca's and Wernicke's areas.
There should be a specific aphasia resulting from damage there.
Exactly, and he was right. That's conduction aphasia, typically from damage to a pathway called the arcuate fasciculus, that bundle of fibers connecting those two areas. People with this condition understand language fine. They can speak fluently.
But there's always a but in neuroscience.
Yeah. Right. They have a really hard time repeating things they hear. It's like the message gets to Wernicke's for comprehension, but then it hits a roadblock on the way to Broca's for pronunciation.
Wow. So you know the answer, but you just can't get it out.
In a nutshell.
That must be so frustrating.
It is, and it really highlights how important these pathways are for the different parts of the brain to communicate with each other.
So fascinating. It makes you wonder, if we've got this network for language, are there differences in how our two hemispheres, left brain and right brain, handle it all?
Ah, excellent question. It takes us to the world of split brain research, which totally shook up our understanding of the hemispheres.
Split brain research. Okay, I remember that being super interesting. That's where they sever the corpus callosum, right?
Yes. The corpus callosum is that thick band of nerve fibers that connects the two hemispheres.
The brain's communication highway.
Exactly. Now, they initially started severing it to treat severe epilepsy, to stop seizures from spreading between the hemispheres.
So it was a medical procedure first.
Exactly. But then researchers started studying these patients, and it changed everything. Because the corpus callosum was cut, researchers could see what each half of the brain could do on its own, almost like having two brains to study.
Okay, that's pretty cool. Two brains for the price of one.
Right, and they found that the two hemispheres were very different, especially when it came to language.
Which we already kind of knew, right? I mean, for most people, the left side is dominant for language.
That's right, we see it with the aphasias and everything. But the split brain research takes it a step further. Well, because those hemispheres can't talk to each other anymore, you can test them in isolation. Imagine showing a picture of, say, a cat only to the left visual field.
Which is processed by the right hemisphere, right?
Exactly. And then you ask the person to name what they saw.
Okay, so the right brain sees the cat, but the left brain usually does the talking. What happens?
Here's the wild part. Often, the person will say, I don't see anything. But if you ask them to point to what they saw with their left hand,
Controlled by the right hemisphere.
exactly, they can do it.
No way. So even though they couldn't say what they saw, their right hemisphere knew it was a cat all along.
Precisely. That was revolutionary. It meant the right hemisphere, while usually silent, understands language. It might not be able to speak, but it's listening and understanding.
It's like the left brain and right brain are having two separate experiences. Mind-blowing. So what you're saying is we've got this whole other side of our brain processing information, including language, but we're not even aware of it.
It's a question that still fascinates neuroscientists. But the right hemisphere brings its own strengths to the table.
Like what?
Well, research suggests it's better at understanding humor, recognizing emotions in language, grasping the big picture of what's being said.
So it's like the left brain is all about the literal meaning and the grammar, while the right brain is picking up on the subtle cues, the emotions, the overall meaning.
You got it.
It makes me wonder if people who are considered more right-brained might be better at understanding things like sarcasm.
There's some evidence to support that. But we have to remember, most of us have those two hemispheres in constant communication.
Thank goodness. Otherwise, we'd all be walking around with two separate realities going on in our heads.
Right. So in a neurotypical brain, those hemispheres are constantly talking, sharing information through the corpus callosum, each one bringing its own expertise to create this seamless language experience.
The dynamic duo,
Mhm.
working together to make language happen. So cool how much is going on in there without us even realizing it.
It really is. And it's not just about how the hemispheres work together, but also their physical differences.
Oh, like the actual structure of the brain is different. Tell me more. That's right, the actual structure. Like, are we talking different shapes, different sizes? What's going on in there?
Well, one of the most studied examples is this area called the planum temporale.
Lamb temporal. Okay, gotta write that down.
It's a region in the temporal lobe, and it's been a source of fascination for neuroscientists studying language for ages.
And I'm guessing it has something to do with the left hemisphere being dominant for language.
You know it. They found that the planum temporale is often larger on the left side of the brain.
So, like, our brains are literally built differently on each side. That's wild.
It is. And they've even found this asymmetry, this size difference, in the brains of apes.
No way. Apes, too.
Yep. It's led to a lot of speculation that maybe, just maybe, the left hemisphere's talent for language is partly due to this pre-existing size difference in the planum temporale. Like it's primed for it.
The brain is pre-wired for language, at least on the left side.
Yeah.
Incredible. But I'm sensing a but coming.
There's always a but, right? As with most things in the brain, it's not quite that straightforward. Turns out there's another brain area that might be even more important. The insula.
The insula. Okay, that one's new to me.
It's a bit of an unsung hero, the insula. It's involved in all sorts of things, from our senses to our emotions, but we don't hear about it as much as, say, the amygdala or the hippocampus.
Busy little brain region, huh? So what's its connection to language? Spill the tea.
Well, the size of the insula, particularly on the left side, might be a better predictor of language dominance than even the planum temporale.
Really? So move over, planum temporal, there's a new player in town.
Hmm.
But if it's so important for language, why haven't we heard more about it?
That's the thing. We actually don't know as much about the insula's role in language compared to, say, Broca's area or Wernicke's area, so it's a hot topic for research.
I bet. It just shows how much we still don't know about the brain. But we've come a long way from just looking at brains after damage. The text mentioned how brain stimulation and imaging have given us even more clues.
Oh, absolutely. Those tools have been game changers. We can actually see the brain in action.
Like watch language happen in real time. That's so cool.
It is. Even those early brain stimulation studies, though less precise than what we have now, gave us some of the first real proof for what Broca and Wernicke had proposed.
How did those studies even work? Like, did they just zap people's brains and see what happened to their speech?
Well, not quite like that. It was more controlled. Wilder Penfield, a neurosurgeon we've talked about before, did some really cool work in this area.
Okay, I'm listening.
He would stimulate different brain areas with electricity while patients were awake, and he'd ask them to describe what they experienced.
Awake. I don't know if I can handle that.
It sounds intense, right? But through those studies, Penfield found that stimulating certain spots, usually in the left hemisphere, could mess with speech, just like with aphasia.
So, like, stimulating one area might make someone momentarily forget a word, and stimulation other might cause them to make grammar mistakes, like a temporary controlled aphasia.
You got it. It's as if you're temporarily turning off a part of the brain's language network to see what happens. And the results. More support for those key language areas we've been talking about.
Wow. And now we have things like fMRI, where we can actually see those areas light up while people are using language.
Exactly. We can watch the brain think.
So, have these newer studies just confirmed what we already thought, or have there been any surprises?
They've definitely shown us that those classic language areas are important, but they've also revealed that language processing is way more spread out than we thought. It's not just one area here, one area there, but this whole network working together.
Like a brain-wide symphony orchestra.
Perfect analogy. And even though we usually think of the left brain as the language expert, these studies have shown that the right hemisphere lights up during language tasks too. It's not just sitting there doing nothing.
Right. So, even though it's usually quiet, the right brain is still involved in language, adding its own flair to the mix. Amazing how much is going on in our heads that we don't even realize.
It really is. And it just goes to show language is this incredibly complex, intricate process that we're only just beginning to understand.
Totally. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the brain and language. We've journeyed through those key language areas, unpacked groundbreaking research, and even glimpsed the amazing technology that's helping us unlock the secrets of how we communicate.
It's been quite the ride. And like with any good deep dive, we're left with even more questions than when we started.
Isn't that always the way? It just makes you appreciate how amazing and mysterious the human brain really is. Well, that's it for today's deep dive. We'll catch you next time with another fascinating topic, and until then, keep those brains buzzing.